My God, they killed Brightwing. Poor, cute, innocent little Brightwing has been murdered by the monsters at Blizzard. Look how much worse Brightwing is than Paparazzi. That's right, folks. It's time for everybody's favorite video series, Murdered Cards, where we take a look at old cards that have in one way or another been eclipsed by cards from the latest Hearthstone set. That can mean a couple things. Number one, new cards can just be way more powerful, do the same sort of thing, but just have bigger numbers, for instance. I think Paparazzi is a pretty good example of that. In other ways, cards can be design evolutions and have been murdered. In other words, they were made more fun or more compelling and strategic, or perhaps just more competitive in some way or another, like tightening up the screws a little bit on designs, evolving cards in a way that makes the old ones feel outclassed and dated compared to the newer versions. And this is probably the best example ever. Like, this is just a really good example of that, exactly, because I think Paparazzi has cranked up the numbers to make this card feel more competitive. Obviously a 3-4 versus a 3-2 for the same cost, but this battle cry, despite doing basically the same sort of thing, is a far more fun version to play with. Brightwing being a random legendary added to your hand, that means the reliability on this card is incredibly low. There are so many bad legendaries, things that just have weirdly awful stat lines or synergies that aren't really made for your deck, so they have some kind of key synergy you can't actually exploit or utilize at all, so it just sits there completely wasted. So Brightwing, you know, half the time would give you some absolute garbage. It wasn't a curve fit, it didn't have a synergy fit, might just be a really low quality card as well. So just really hard to use Brightwing, right? Complete chaos, complete unpredictability. Now with Paparazzi using Discover instead of randomness, that does a couple things. Number one, it limits the pool. So Brightwing could give you cards from other classes, which could technically very occasionally be an upside, getting some kind of broken thing, but again, reliability wise, super unlikely. Paparazzi, though, you're gonna get cards for your class and of course neutral legendaries, which are much more likely to fit your game plan, because you're gonna find things that have synergies with your classes. If you're Shaman, you're gonna maybe get like Overload stuff, and you've got Overload cards, of course. Various examples are possible there. But you've got a fit consideration, plus because you have that choice baked into Discover, of course, you're going to get a card that is just much better in a given game state as well. I can take a 4-drop to fill in my curve if I want. I could take a value card versus a damage card, depending on what I'm looking to do in a given game. So Paparazzi both gives you more, you know, strategic depth, picking cards that are meaningful, giving you choice, agency over your actions, and it also just gives you things that are more likely to fit well, raising the floor of consistency here a little bit so you don't get that absolute garbage that Brightwing would very often give you. So pretty crazy to see the two differences between these cards, particularly because Brightwing's not even that old. Brightwing's from 2019. That's only, it was like 3.5 years ago or so that Brightwing came out. Almost 4 years, I guess. But you know, has been changed so much here. To go from a legendary to a common is pretty crazy, and also just to see changes in positive directions in two different ways, both from a stat standpoint and from a battle cry standpoint as well. So I personally think this is a good example of an evolution of a card. Paparazzi's way more fun, way more consistent, has a higher likelihood to actually be useful to people and to actually get played, whereas Brightwing, of course, never really got played. So I would consider this a brutal murdering, certainly, to take out poor Brightwing, but probably for the best. I guess I'm pro Brightwing murder in this particular instance. So moving on here, we've got Drum Circle versus Gift of the Wild. I think another really clear-cut example here of a murder. You may not even really remember Gift of the Wild. This was actually introduced, I think, in the same patch as Brightwing, when they did like a little core set thing, swapping out some cards, swapping in some cards, as I recall. 8-mana druid spell, give your minions +2/+2 and taunt. And obviously that was really expensive and bad at the time. There's so many other cheap buffs and cheap ways to get stats that this one just didn't really make sense. The like defensive utility of the taunt was super weird too. I remember thinking this card was so strange when it got printed then. And nowadays we've got Drum Circle just introduced, and this one gives you an even better buff for 7 mana, because it's got +2/+4 and taunt. So obviously if you're looking to be defensive, that extra 2 health per minion's gonna be awesome. So immediately just way better right off the bat, cheaper and bigger stats. But then also it's got this flexibility with choose one, which is nice because if you need to, you can also summon 5 2/2 treants, and that's really great because sometimes in these Druid wide board decks you have this problem where you have to have this right mix of board development and board follow-up. You need ways to make minions and ways to buff your minions. And when you run cards like Gift of the Wild, these really big all-in ways that only do one side of that, of course, they can be really limiting because it's like, oh man, I've just kept getting my boards cleared. I have no way to build a board, and now Gift of the Wild is just totally dead. But Drum Circle comes in and it fixes that problem because suddenly now this can be a board if you need it. And if you already happen to have the board that's stuck, boom, this is the awesome follow-up. I think other successful cards in this mold have been things like Arbor Up. Remember, that would both give you the minions and buff your minions. So if you needed to just make a couple like 4/3s on board on an empty board, you could. It was nice in a pinch to have that backup plan. Or of course, if you just wanted it to cement your board and offer some big time stats, it could do that as well. So Drum Circle falls more in that middle ground with that flexibility, which is really nice. I still think Drum Circle is a pretty expensive card, still not absolutely amazing or anything, despite going bonkers on Gift of the Wild here with a crazy harsh murder in this case. So probably a healthy evolution here. Gift of the Wild I think was just always too weak when it came out. Drum Circle feels cool, particularly some of the like delayed summon stuff we're seeing in Druid right now with Rhythm and Roots and the Timber Tambourine that can both summon 5/5s for later. So this card feels well positioned. I think it fixes a lot of the bad feelings of the design of a one-directional card by making this two-directional instead. So yet again, I think this is a great example of an evolution that remains reasonable from a power level. It's not crazy power creep that's ruining the game or anything, but you know, just taking things into a playable, more consistent state. All right, so moving on, this example pops up every single time, and I will continue to put it in every single video because Silverback Patriarch is the most murdered card in history. Every expansion, it seems like something takes out the Patriarch all over again. This, of course, looking at his 3-mana version here, his OG form. And now we've got Barrel of Monkeys, 2-mana spell for Hunter. 2 mana, remember? Summon a 1/4 monkey with taunt, so you get your Patriarch for 2. You proc some spell synergies along the way, in Hunter in particular these days, and then you still get 2 more monkeys, so you've got this extra value in hand on top of the fact that you're getting an even cheaper monkey than before. And yes, of course, the Patriarch always sucked. He's never really been a good card in Hearthstone. He always felt like he couldn't trade well for a 3-drop. And that still remains true today, obviously, with the Barrel of Monkeys. The 1/4s don't trade especially well. But I found with this card that having 3 of them really does make a difference because you can just start weaving this into turns. It becomes this speed bump of sorts that really slows your opponent down, having to constantly whack through these Silverback Patriarchs, just giving you time, filling your mana until you might want to do something else, like play some big beasts later that really help you swing. So it turns out, you know, having this repeatable monkey turn after turn is actually what the Patriarch always needed. On his lonesome, he wasn't quite enough, but he needed to join a group. He needed to be with his family, and then he could finally succeed. He was a Patriarch, but with no family there to support him. And now at the Barrel of Monkeys, he actually seems pretty decent. It's the secret all along. So next up here, we have a couple priest cards, and I wanted to showcase these because this is probably less of a murder and more of like a wound, a scratch, perhaps. Because I don't think these cards are functionally all that different, despite coming out, you know, years and years apart here. We're looking at Seance and Power Chord Synchronized. Seance, as I recall, was really one of the better cards in Rosticon's Rumble. Overall, a pretty weak expansion, but I can remember Seance being useful from time to time. And Power Chord Synchronized has the same exact base text here. One's Shadow, one's Holy, but they do the exact same thing. The upside on Power Chord Synchronized here is that if you have the Finale, you give both of the cards +1/+2, which is nice, don't get me wrong. Like, giving a buff to your unit on board in particular can be really valuable. The buff stats in hands probably aren't as great, but still, you know, it's a nice bonus freebie. But I would say, for people who care about these cards and this effect, for decks that are trying to get copies of cards, the stats are probably going to be secondary to the copy a lot of the time. In other words, you want that copy. That's why you're running this. You're not running it for a 2-mana 1/2 buff that's conditional, right? Because you don't always hit the finale as needed. Sometimes it would be a little awkward to pull off the finale. So, you know, maybe something like 85-90% of the value is baked into the first part of the card, not the finale, in which case Seance and Power Chord Synchronize, functionally for a lot of decks and a lot of plays, are actually going to be exactly the same card despite coming out 4+ years apart, which is actually pretty surprising to see. So like I said, a little bit more of a wound than a murder, which, given it's a Rastakhan's Rumble card in particular, I think is rather surprising given the history and the mockery that Rastakhan's has received over time. They basically reprinted a Rastakhan's Rumble card, and it's still good today. It's actually great. It's being played in controlled priest decks. I saw it was in 4.1% of all decks right now, which isn't too bad at all. So really cool that an old card like this just barely got change. You know, it's not insignificant. Again, I don't want to downplay the significance of a buff. Of course it's valuable, but again, for the most part, this is a very similar design. It didn't take much, let's say, to push this to the next level for modern Hearthstone and make it competitive. So next up, this one's an intriguing one. It's Instrument Tech versus Cage Match Custodian and Cavern Shiny Finder. All of them are 2-mana draw a weapon cards. So they're tutoring you weapons for 2 mana. But importantly, Cage Match Custodian and Cavern Shiny Finder were both class cards for Shaman and Rogue respectively, but Instrument Tech has shed those restrictions as a neutral card. Now, normally we see more power baked into class cards. Sometimes more intricate designs are baked into class cards because they have built-in restrictions and limitations, and it's easier to control the design space around that card. We can say, hey, we're not going to print any broken weapons for Shaman because they have Cage Match Custodian, or we're not going to print any broken weapons for Rogue because they have Cavern Shiny Finder, or maybe we will with Kingsbane and then we'll regret it. But, you know, in theory, that's the idea. Clearly, Shiny Finder was kind of built to help you find your Kingsbane. That's the other side of it. You can build things to encourage powerful plays. But the Instrument Tech said, no, wait a minute, no, we're not going to worry about any of those potential problems. We're just going to make it a neutral weapon tutor. And what happened? It immediately broke the game because suddenly Instrument Tech is used in wild format for Druid to find its busted Twig of the World Tree, and wild format goes haywire with Twig of the World Tree Druid running rampant over the meta, so much so that it's already been nerfed. So an interesting showcase here, how sometimes it can be really dangerous to change a card in this way, or open up this design space a little bit by making things neutral, and how important a lever that can be sometimes to pull when it comes to keeping things balanced and keeping things from running amok, basically. So I wanted to see, like, you know, this is technically a little weaker from a stat standpoint. Each of those have 4 stats. The Instrument Tech only has 3, but the real power of this one is that it's a neutral card. It's available to everybody, and boy, can that create some problems, especially given the backlog of cards available in wild format. So speaking of class versus neutral cards, this is the other side of that equation that I wanted to showcase here, because we got the Violet Illusionist, a card all the way back from Karazhan. I kind of forgot this was from Karazhan. 3 mana 4/3. During your turn, your hero is immune, which that is an effect that is allowed for all kinds of shenanigans throughout the years, doing crazy, silly OTKs and memes and so on and so forth. And now we have the Void Virtuoso taking this same exact effect and making it only 1 mana. So way cheaper here than the Violet Illusionist, which you might think, oh my god, that's scary. How many broken combos and silly things can happen? But given this class restriction of Warlock, of course, helps control and limit some of those problems, because now anything that might be broken with the Violet Illusionist, suddenly you can prevent that stuff in Warlock and make sure that this card remains in a much healthier space. So yes, it may look like it's 3 times cheaper and it could be totally busted, but they have some control over how this card can be utilized. That said, I still think Void Virtuoso is going to be pretty good. Warlock's a great class to utilize this effect with things like their hero power and all their self-damage, so it's definitely going to get to explore some positive synergies here thanks to this effect, but maybe nothing crazy or broken will unfold on the back of the Void Virtuoso that might be opened up, say, in other classes in wild format. No Twig of the World Tree sort of problems are possible thanks to the Void Virtuoso here being much, much cheaper. And then for my final card here, I've got a fun one. It's Snakebite versus Wicked Skeleton. Did you, like me, forget that the Wicked Skeleton is a real Hearthstone card? He came out in Knights of the Frozen Throne. I do remember saying this is probably one of the worst cards ever. A 4-mana 1/1. He was not undead at the time, but he is now. And Battlecry gained +1/+1 for each minion that died this turn. So 4 mana with this stat upside. If a bunch of stuff died off, you could make yourself a reasonably sized dude for 4 mana. You know, maybe if you're lucky, you get a 4 mana 5/5 with a lot of work going into it. But nowadays, with Snakebite here in Demon Hunter, we have the exact same text. Gain +1/+1 for each minion that died this turn, but she's half the cost at only 2 mana, and she has a rush as well. Not to mention, of course, the sort of ease of use of getting even more stuff on board and killed off in, say, a Rush Demon Hunter with all these 1/1 rushers is probably far easier today than it was in Wicked Skeleton's era. So easier to activate, half the cost, and of course immediate upside to trade with this rush as well. Makes Snakebite like literally 1,000 times better. Literally 1,000 times better than the Wicked Skeleton. And yes, I know she's a class card. She's allowed to be a little better, but clearly this takes things in an entirely different level. And here's the crazy thing, right? Despite Demon Hunter getting played a lot, despite Demon Hunter playing some rush token cards, there's a lot of little minions floating around. Security is getting played in Demon Hunter decks. Snakebite is still only in 0.12% of decks. She's really not played in Demon Hunter despite this crazy evolution. So I don't know if that tells us just how bad Wicked Skeleton was. I don't know if it tells us how far the game has come since 2017 with Knights of the Frozen Throne, but there's some kind of takeaway here, some kind of lesson to see, because it is absolutely bonkers how much better Snakebite is and still isn't quite good enough. So there you go, folks. Those are the murdered cards of Festival of Legends. I'm sure I missed some examples. If you guys have other examples. Oh, I actually have one I decided not to talk about. Candle Raiser and Silver Moon Guardian was another example. It was just too boring to talk about. So that's another example, but I'm sure there are even more I missed. So if you guys have other cards that you think have been eclipsed or murdered in one way or another, share those in the comments below. Always fun to see what you think. If you want to be anally retentive people that say it's not fair to compare class cards with neutral cards, go away. I can do whatever I like. It's my YouTube channel. You must watch. Or not. You could just go away too. But anyway, thanks much as always for the rest of you who are cool and chill and want to have some fun. Love you all a ton. Thanks much as always for watching. And until next time, game on.